So sometimes they don't have, I mean, this is so rare now that you'll see this, but old bathroom doors that don't open the correct way for someone in a wheelchair, that has to be, like, that would have to be amended under this title. New structures must be designed to be readily accessible and usable for individuals with disability. Title IV ensures that individuals with speech and hearing impairment have access to telephonic services. And Title V contains miscellaneous provisions, including some construction clauses. So disability discrimination, the protected class is composed of employees or applicants for employment who meet 3 discrete provisions. The individual must have a physical or mental impairment. Impairment must be such that it substantially limits one or more major activities of their life. The protected class is composed, and then the person must still be able to perform the essential function of employment, right? So, like I said before, if you're blind and you need to fly a jet, you're obviously not discriminating against that person because it's the essential function of the employer. So defining disability and proving discrimination. Once a disability is shown, then one can examine the concept of discrimination. Court cases continue to challenge the definition of a qualified individual with a disability. Courts examine how individuals with disabilities accommodate their disability. Judged on a case-by-case basis include, but not limited to, job restructuring, part-time or modified work schedule, offering of lower pay positions for which the individual is qualified, reassignment or transfers to other departments that have vacant positions, acquisition or modification of equipment or devices, educational materials or policies, and the provision of qualified readers or interpreters. So failure to offer reasonable accommodation can bring a lawsuit, and the court has to decide what constitutes reasonable accommodation. Employer has no responsibility to create a new position for an employee. So if somebody, if your essential job function required you to walk and you can't walk anymore, they're not required to create a new job position to accommodate you. Now, if you are in data entry and you're blind and you need a Braille computer now, they should be able to accommodate that. Or, for example, I worked with a nurse who she was caught diverting medication, and she went to rehabilitation and decided that, to be safe, she didn't want to work in patient care. She wanted to do like education or something, and she was qualified to do it, obviously. So she was able to transfer to that position to accommodate her. And I know technically that drug addiction doesn't count toward disability, but that's kind of an example of reasonable accommodation. The court must decide what constitutes reasonable accommodation. Employer has no responsibility to give a position to a disabled employee for which the employee is not qualified, or to train them for that position. So they're not responsible for doing that. So this is what I have lots of patients who work at Amazon. They get injured and then they want like a light duty position, but it's not part of their essential job function. I tell them that, you're not going to get reasonably accommodated for that. So they get fired or let go, and they don't understand why that happens. So it's definitely something you have to explain to people. Essential job functions. So functions that a person must be able to perform to be qualified for the employment position. Not qualifications that would be ideal to possess. It's important to determine whether an individual with a disability is qualified. The enforcement of the American Disability Act is done primarily through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and enforcement ensures one of the primary purposes of the Act, that no one will be given a greater advantage in employment opportunity, public service, transportation, and communication. So the ADA summary, it represents an expansive vision of the capability of disabled individuals. and societal costs of discrimination against and isolation of disabled individuals far outweigh the economic costs of accommodation. The scope is vast, and the Act can be expected to create major changes in areas where the disabled have been subject to discrimination, isolation, and segregation. So the Civil Rights Act is rooted in heightened visibility of sexual harassment. The Clarence Thomas Supreme Court confirmation hearings of 1991 pushed sexual harassment to the top of the agenda. Sexual harassment accounts for the majority of cases brought under the Civil Rights Act. So definition of sexual harassment. The Act defines sexual harassment as unwelcome sexual conduct that is a term of employment. There are two categories. There's quid pro quo sexual harassment and then hostile work environment. So quid pro quo sexual harassment occurs when submission to or rejection of sexual conduct is used as a basis for employment decisions affecting the individual, and employers are strictly liable for the conduct of supervisory personnel in quid pro quo harassment suits. Hostile work environment is, in this case, there are no tangible job benefits or detriments. The employee is subject to sexual remarks, innuendos, and physical act, and the employer is not strictly liable in such a suit, but becomes so if a complaint is filed with the employer. So a reasonable woman standard developed in the courts early on and acknowledged the cumulative corrosive effect of their work environment over time and the impact of the stress inflicted on her by the continuing presence of harassing behavior. And this has since been written to include men. Conduct need not be directed at a person filing the complaint. Observing or knowing of the behavior may affect psychological well-being. Employees who feel sexually harassed should notify supervisors or the employer directly. The employer has a duty to investigate the report and document the investigation. Employees who feel sexually harassed should maintain confidentiality and report back to the initiating complainant. Termination of alleged harasser is not mandatory. Other remedial actions may be taken. Some action must be taken to avoid a lawsuit. So what that means is, if you complain about someone sexually harassing you, they don't have to get fired. Other remedial action can happen. And you have to do your employer will have to do something to avoid a lawsuit. An employer has a responsibility to combat sexual harassment on the job. So that's why, there's mandatory sexual harassment training. So justice and fairness. How far must companies and healthcare institutions extend themselves to accommodate employees with special needs? Should there be a clause that protects the disabled worker, but only to the extent economically feasible? So what that means is, what if you work for a small company that can't afford to put in wheelchair ramps? Should that company be penalized? So that's, these are ethical issues that go into it. Value people with disabilities. Differences should be embraced, not feared and excluded. Challenges the societal impulse to focus on what is perceived as a person's disability. Terminating employment. Effect on people who rely on the employee's salary for survival. The effect on the self-worth and morale of the worker themselves and on other employees. So, when you talk about staff that needs to get fired, and then ethically, are we responsible knowing that this is how they, provide for their children, or how it's going to affect other people? Is that something that we should consider? And is that consideration going to further be consideration during a negligence case, right? So, you keep a nurse on who wasn't necessarily skilled enough to be working anymore, and then later when they ask, why didn't you terminate this nurse earlier, and you answer, with your ethical issues, are those covered? So what do you guys think? Probably not, right? But these are still ethical issues that we have to ask. Terminating employment needs to be weighed with the possible ethical harm that may occur if the employee is allowed to continue to work within the institution. Respect for all persons, healthcare institutions should allow equal opportunities.